Savannah collapsed onto the hardwood floor the exact second her eyes met mine as I stepped into the living room, instantly transforming our quiet Portland home into a chaotic scene of manufactured panic. My name is Paige. I am 28 years old, and I have spent most of my life navigating the toxic minefield of my sister's calculated health crises. Mom lunged toward me with a face twisted in pure hatred, while Dad stood frozen by the window, his usual silence acting as a silent endorsement of the madness unfolding before us. Before I could even set my bag down, Mom was already screaming that I was nothing but a curse to this family who brought disaster whenever I dared to show my face. The atmosphere grew suffocating as she pointed a trembling finger toward the door, demanding that I leave her house immediately and never return to upset the fragile peace again. I didn't waste my breath arguing or trying to explain the reality of the situation because I knew that words were useless against their decades of blind devotion. Instead, I calmly reached into my pocket to activate the miniature voice recorder I had strategically placed earlier, marking the final step of a plan they never saw coming. As I gripped my suitcase and walked out into the freezing Oregon rain, I felt a strange sense of clarity knowing that their world was about to be shattered by the very truth they had spent years trying to ignore. You are a jinx, Paige. Every time you show up, something terrible happens to this family, so just get out and stay gone. If you have ever been turned into the villain by a family that chooses to believe a beautiful lie over a difficult truth, subscribe now to see exactly how I used my professional expertise to reclaim my life and expose the ultimate betrayal. I drove through the darkness for 30 miles along the highway to reach my private rented apartment without shedding a single tear. This silence was not a sign of weakness, but rather a familiar shield I had developed over years of being the designated scapegoat for every family crisis. My small studio in Portland served as a sanctuary where logic prevailed over the emotional manipulation that defined the house I had just been forced to leave. While my mother believed I was a harbinger of misfortune, my professional colleagues knew me as a meticulous insurance claims investigator who specialized in dismantling complex financial fraud. My career required a cold eye for detail, as well as an intuitive sense for spotting the tiny cracks in a person's fabricated story. The suspicion regarding Savannah had not formed overnight, because I had been tracking the inconsistencies in her behavior for several months before this final confrontation. I clearly remembered the evening I discovered a stack of medical invoices left carelessly on the kitchen counter, while everyone else was busy catering to her supposed migraine. My professional training kicked in immediately, as I noticed that the font on the hospital headers looked slightly misaligned compared to the official documents I processed daily at the office. These small digital artifacts were the first red flags that suggested someone had been altering the figures to justify much larger payouts from our family's shared medical fund. The reality of the situation became even more alarming when I realized Savannah was currently pressuring Mom to withdraw $200,000 from their primary retirement savings for an experimental treatment. My parents worked their entire lives in the postal service to secure that money, yet they were prepared to hand it over without questioning the validity of the clinic. Silas. My father was too exhausted from years of conflict to challenge the narrative, while Beverly, my mother, was blinded by a desperate need to be the savior of her youngest daughter. Seeing them fall into this financial trap felt like watching a slow-motion disaster that only I had the tools to prevent. Accessing the national insurance database from my secure home office provided the definitive proof I needed to transform my suspicions into a formal investigation. I spent the early hours of the morning cross-referencing Savannah's Social Security number against every active medical policy and registered healthcare provider in the state of Oregon. The search results returned a chilling void, which confirmed that her alleged specialized insurance plan simply did not exist in any official capacity. There were no records of the surgeries she claimed to have undergone, nor any trace of the high-end specialists she frequently mentioned during family dinners. This was no longer just a case of a sister seeking attention through lies, because it had evolved into a calculated scheme to defraud our own parents. Instead of confronting them with these dry numbers and risking another explosive argument, I decided to build a comprehensive internal file at my agency to serve as legal leverage. I knew that my word alone would never be enough to break the spell Savannah held over our parents' hearts or their bank accounts. My decision to gather high-quality audio recordings was born from the necessity of having undeniable, living evidence that captured the raw truth of her deceit. Numbers on a screen could be dismissed as technical errors by a defensive mother, but hearing the architect of the fraud admit to the scam in her own voice would be impossible to ignore. I spent the remainder of the night organizing my findings with the cold precision of a hunter who understood that the perfect trap required patience rather than impulsive anger. My life was now divided between the daughter they had discarded and the professional investigator who held the power to bring their entire world of lies crashing down. 10 days before the night I was kicked out of the house, I scheduled a meeting with my Aunt Joanna at a small cafe in the suburbs. She had been estranged from the family for over a decade, living in a quiet town far away from the toxic influence of my parents' household. As soon as we sat down, she handed me an old folder containing documents that she had carefully preserved since the day she was exiled. Joanna revealed the truth about why our family cut her off, explaining that she was the only one brave enough to call out Savannah for faking her very first major illness. It was a pattern of behavior that started early, and my aunt had tried to warn Silas and Beverly before the lies became a permanent reality. She provided documented evidence from our childhood, showing that Savannah used to intentionally cause minor self-inflicted injuries just to blame me when no one was looking. I looked at the old photographs of scratched furniture and broken toys, realizing that my sister's talent for manipulation was actually a skill refined through years of practice. It was chilling to see how she had learned to cry on command, even as a young child, successfully convincing everyone that I was the aggressive sibling. These early rehearsals had laid the groundwork for the sophisticated financial scams she was currently running against our own parents. Joanna watched me flip through the pages, her expression filled with a mixture of deep pity and grim recognition of the cycle repeating itself. The conversation clarified my own motivations because I needed to be certain that I was acting out of protection rather than simple resentment. My primary goal was to safeguard the retirement funds of Mom and Dad, even if they currently viewed me as their greatest enemy in life. I realized that if I allowed Savannah to continue her path, our parents would be left penniless and homeless within the next few years. My aunt nodded in agreement when I explained my plan to use my professional background to build a bulletproof case against the fraud. We spent the next hour establishing a precise timeline for my investigation, ensuring that every piece of evidence would be tied to a specific date and action. I decided that the only way to end this was to return to the old house one last time to plant the final recording devices in the living room. Joanna reached across the table to squeeze my hand, her voice low and steady, as she gave me the most honest advice I had heard in years. She told me that Silas and Beverly were too deep in their denial to ever believe my warnings without undeniable proof that bypassed their emotions. The meeting ended with a sense of shared purpose, giving me the strength to face the upcoming confrontation with a cold and calculated focus. I knew that the truth would be painful for them to hear, but allowing the lie to continue would be a much greater betrayal of our family's future. Your parents will never believe you until they hear the cruelest truth with their own ears, Paige. I left the cafe with the folder tucked securely under my arm, ready to execute the final stage of my strategy to expose the darkness hidden within our home. The silence between me and my parents was no longer a burden because it had become the perfect cover for the investigation I was about to finalize. My professional duty as an investigator and my personal responsibility as a daughter were finally aligned toward a single unavoidable goal: Every step I took from that moment on was designed to ensure that the truth would eventually speak louder than any of Savannah's carefully staged performances. On Thursday morning, exactly 4 days before that fateful evening, I returned to my parents' house while they were out grocery shopping. I used my old spare key to enter the silent hallway heading straight for the upper floor to retrieve the data from the hidden recording device. My heart hammered against my ribs as I synced the small transmitter to my tablet, scrolling through hours of muffled background noise and mundane household sounds. Suddenly, the audio cleared as I reached a recording from the previous night when Savannah thought she was completely alone in her bedroom. I sat on the edge of my old bed listening to the chilling sound of my sister laughing while she spoke to someone on her mobile phone. The recording captured her discussing a detailed plan with her boyfriend about the eventual sale of Mom and Dad's house once the title was transferred. I listened in stunned silence as Savannah joked about how easy it was to manipulate our mother with just a few staged gasps for air. She described how Beverly would rush to her side with tears in her eyes every time she pretended to have a breathing episode whenever I was present. My sister's voice held no trace of the weakness or frailty she performed so convincingly in front of the family during our tense dinners. It was the sound of a predator who viewed our parents' lifetime of hard work as nothing more than a convenient payday for her own selfish desires. The most disgusting part of the conversation was hearing her brag about how my professional skepticism actually worked in her favor by making me look like the villain. She explained to her accomplice that the more I tried to point out the inconsistencies, the more Mom would push me away and cling to her. Savannah seemed to take a twisted pride in her ability to weaponize our mother's protective instincts against the only person who was actually trying to help. This recorded evidence was the final confirmation that my sister was not just seeking attention, but was actively conspiring to leave our parents homeless. I felt a cold wave of resolve wash over me as I realized that the time for subtle warnings had officially come to an end. Later that evening, I sat across from Savannah during dinner while maintaining a perfectly calm expression despite the rage simmering just beneath the surface. I watched her carefully play the role of the exhausted patient leaning heavily against the table while Mom fussed over her every movement. My sister caught my eye and offered a faint manipulative smile, clearly enjoying the fact that she had successfully turned our parents against me. I didn't challenge her lies or point out the obvious flaws in her story because I needed her to remain confident in her own deception. The silence I maintained was a strategic necessity, allowing her to believe that she had finally won the long-standing war for our family's loyalty. The moment of absolute clarity arrived when I watched Mom struggle to prepare a complex herbal tonic while Savannah sat idly by, scrolling through her phone. There was not a single hint of guilt or remorse on my sister's face as she watched our aging mother exhaust herself for a fabricated illness. It became painfully obvious that Savannah had completely detached herself from any sense of familial love or basic human empathy. I gripped my fork tightly, focusing on the hidden recorder still capturing every word spoken at that table for the final file. I knew that within a few days this house would no longer be a place of secrets, and the woman sitting across from me would finally face the consequences of her greed. As long as she signs that transfer deed, we will have more than enough money to leave this miserable city forever. I left the house that night with a heavy secret but a clear path forward, knowing that the evidence on my tablet was enough to dismantle her entire empire of lies. My parents were still living in a dream world where their youngest daughter was a victim, unaware that she was actually the one holding the matches to burn their life down. Every gasping breath she faked and every tear Mom shed was being documented with the cold precision of a criminal investigation. The trap was now fully set, and all I had to do was wait for the right moment to let the truth speak for itself. 3 hours after placing my suitcase in the corner of my apartment, I sat down in front of my computer to extract the final recording from the hidden device. My hands were perfectly steady as I opened the audio file, knowing that the sounds captured in that living room would change everything forever. The recording began with the sharp sound of the front door slamming shut, followed immediately by a burst of loud, triumphant laughter from Savannah. I listened as the audio picked up the distinct clinking of glass, indicating she had immediately poured herself a drink to celebrate my departure. Her voice sounded vibrant and full of energy, with absolutely none of the labored breathing or weakness she had displayed just minutes earlier. It was the sound of a woman who had successfully removed the only obstacle standing between her and our parents' bank accounts. The most valuable part of the entire recording occurred when Mom sat down next to Savannah to offer her words of comfort. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I heard Savannah drop her voice slightly to deliver a shocking confession to our mother. She stated clearly that she had never been sick at all, admitting that she only needed everyone to believe her to maintain control. Instead of reacting with the anger or betrayal I expected, Mom's voice remained soft and filled with an unsettling level of devotion. She told Savannah that the truth didn't matter because she was prepared to do whatever was necessary to ensure her daughter's happiness. It was a moment of profound realization for me as I understood that my mother was a willing participant in her own deception. Mom went even further by promising Savannah that she would begin the process of transferring all their remaining assets into her name the following morning. She explained that this move was a strategic decision to ensure I could never claim any part of the family inheritance or interfere again. Hearing my own mother describe me as an outsider who deserved nothing was a crushing blow that felt more painful than being kicked out. However, as the conversation continued, a strange sense of liberation began to replace the initial sting of her cruel words. I finally realized that my efforts to save them were misplaced because they were committed to a reality that did not include me. The burden of guilt I had carried for years suddenly evaporated as I realized I was finally free from their toxic dynamic. I watched the audio waves move across my screen, recognizing that I now possessed the power to end this cycle of manipulation once and for all. My professional ethics as an investigator left no room for hesitation or emotional bargaining with people who viewed me as a threat. I meticulously compiled the audio clips alongside the fraudulent medical invoices and the unauthorized insurance database searches I had gathered earlier. Each document was labeled and organized into a comprehensive digital folder designed to meet the strict requirements of a federal investigation. There was a sense of grim satisfaction in knowing that Savannah's own arrogance had provided the final piece of evidence needed for her downfall. I took a deep breath as my finger hovered over the mouse, ready to submit the entire file to the federal inspector's office. The final click sent years of secrets and lies directly into the hands of the authorities who dealt with high-level insurance and financial fraud. I sat back in my chair and watched the confirmation message appear on my screen, signaling that the investigation was no longer under my control. My role as a daughter had officially ended, replaced by the cold necessity of being a witness to a crime that had been committed in the name of love. The silence in my apartment felt heavy, yet peaceful, as if the air had finally been cleared of the smog of Savannah's endless deceit. I knew that by morning the life my parents had built on a foundation of lies would begin to crumble under the weight of the law. Mom, I was never sick. I just needed them to believe it, and you believed me more than you ever believed in yourself. The recording ended there, leaving me alone with the digital ghosts of a family that had chosen a beautiful lie over my inconvenient truth. I closed my laptop with a sense of finality, understanding that the coming storm was a direct result of their own choices and actions. My journey toward justice was no longer about seeking approval or trying to be the savior they clearly did not want. It was about ensuring that the truth was documented and that the consequences of their betrayal were finally realized in a court of law. I went to bed knowing that for the first time in my life, I wouldn't have to wake up wondering which version of reality Savannah would invent next. On Monday morning, exactly 7 days since I left that house, 2 federal agents knocked on the door of the Portland residence to execute a formal search warrant. They arrived just as the sun was beginning to hit the porch, bringing a cold reality that my parents were completely unprepared to face. While the neighbors watched from behind their curtains, the agents presented the legal documents authorizing them to seize every electronic device and financial record inside. This sudden intervention was the direct result of the professional report I had quietly filed with my agency weeks before the final confrontation. The Federal Insurance Bureau had been conducting a silent investigation into the suspicious medical claims linked to our family's primary address. My meticulous gathering of fraudulent invoices and recorded confessions provided the necessary probable cause for the authorities to move forward with aggressive legal action. Savannah was led out of the front door in handcuffs while still wearing her pajamas, her face pale and devoid of the smug confidence she had displayed during our last dinner. She tried to initiate one of her signature breathing episodes as the officers guided her toward the waiting vehicle, but the paramedics on site quickly confirmed her vitals were perfectly normal. The sight of her being placed in the back of a police cruiser was a stark contrast to the pampered lifestyle she had maintained through years of manipulation. She was officially charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud and the fabrication of medical records to secure illegal insurance payouts. My parents stood on the lawn in a state of absolute shock as they watched their favorite daughter being treated like a common criminal. The realization that their unwavering support had actually enabled a serious felony began to settle over them like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Mom and Dad fell into a state of pure panic when they received an automated notification that their primary bank accounts had been frozen by the authorities. The federal government was moving to recover the massive fines and restitution costs associated with the fraudulent insurance claims Savannah had filed in their name. Beverly sat on the porch steps and sobbed openly while Silas stood motionless, staring at the empty space where his daughter's car used to be parked. They had sacrificed their entire retirement and their reputation to protect a lie that was now burning their life to the ground. The phone calls started flooding my mobile device almost immediately, with hundreds of frantic messages begging me to use my professional influence to fix the situation. I listened to a few seconds of my mother's hysterical voice before I decided to change my number and cut off their primary line of communication. I refused to take any direct calls from my family members, firmly instructing them through a brief text message to only contact me through my designated legal representative. My attorney had already prepared a formal statement clarifying my role as a whistleblower and a witness for the federal prosecution team. I understood that any emotional conversation at this stage would only serve to pull me back into the cycle of guilt they had used to control me for decades. The boundary I had established was no longer a suggestion, but a legal and emotional necessity for my own survival and peace of mind. I spent the afternoon at my office focusing on my legitimate casework, refusing to let the chaos in Portland disrupt the professional life I had worked so hard to build. Dad actually drove all the way to my office building later that week in a desperate attempt to corner me for a face-to-face conversation. I watched from the window of my fourth-floor office as the security guards politely but firmly escorted him out of the main lobby and back toward his vehicle. He looked smaller and more defeated than I had ever seen him, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a reality he could no longer ignore. I observed his departure with an expression of cold detachment, feeling no urge to run down the stairs and offer him the comfort he had consistently denied me. The man who had stood by and watched me be kicked out into the rain was now seeking the very protection he had failed to provide. My heart remained still as I watched him drive away, knowing that the bridge between us had been burned by their own choices long ago. This investigation actually began the very moment you signed your name on that first fake medical invoice, Savannah. The fallout from my sister's greed was now an unstoppable force that would dismantle everything my parents had spent their lives trying to build. I knew that the coming months would involve grueling court dates and the inevitable loss of their home to pay for the mounting legal fees and restitution. There was no joy in witnessing their downfall, but there was a profound sense of justice in seeing the truth finally take its place at the center of our family history. I went back to my desk and continued my work, leaving the ghosts of Portland to face the consequences of the darkness they had invited into their home. The professional investigator in me knew that the case was solid, while the daughter in me knew that the healing could only begin once the lies were completely eradicated. 20 days after the federal investigation began, my family home in Portland was officially sealed by the bank to recover the unpaid debts. I watched the live feed from a local news site as workers placed heavy plywood over the windows where I once played as a young child. The primary residence that represented my parents' entire life of labor was now just another asset being liquidated by the government. Beverly and Silas were forced to move into a cramped, dilapidated rental apartment on the far edge of the industrial district. This new reality was a harsh contrast to the comfortable suburban life they had maintained, while shielding Savannah from any accountability. They spent their days surrounded by cardboard boxes, facing the undeniable truth that their blindness had cost them everything they owned. My father sat in the middle of their small living room staring at the peeling wallpaper, while my mother wept over the loss of her heirloom furniture. There was no one left to blame for their current misery because the evidence of their own complicity was now a matter of public record. Savannah received a sentence of intensive community service, along with a massive restitution order that far exceeded her ability to pay in this lifetime. She was now drowning in a mountain of debt that effectively stripped her of any chance to start over or flee the city as she had planned. Every dollar she earned for the next several decades would be automatically garnished to repay the insurance companies she had defrauded. I saw photos of her picking up trash along the highway, her face no longer showing the arrogance of a master manipulator, but the weariness of a common debtor. Her boyfriend had vanished the moment the federal agents appeared, leaving her to face the legal and financial wreckage entirely on her own. The sophisticated life she had envisioned while mocking our parents was replaced by the cold, daily grind of mandatory labor and endless court appearances. The isolation of the family became absolute when Joanna publicly shared the truth about the events that had occurred 10 years prior. Our neighbors and extended relatives finally understood the reason behind my aunt's long exile, leading them to withdraw all social support. No one offered to help my parents move their belongings or provided a place to stay while they searched for their new apartment. The community members who once pitied Savannah for her supposed illness now viewed the entire household with a mixture of disgust and deep-seated resentment. My parents found themselves completely alone in their grief, realizing that the loyalty they demanded from others had been built on a foundation of lies. The silence from the outside world was perhaps the most brutal part of their punishment, because it confirmed their irrelevance in the eyes of everyone they once knew. I received a long pleading letter from Mom that was delivered to my office by a courier service 2 days ago. She begged for my forgiveness, claiming that she was just a mother who wanted to believe the best of her child. I read the first few lines before walking over to the fireplace and quietly tossing the envelope into the glowing embers. There was no anger left in my heart, only a profound sense of finality that made any further conversation feel entirely pointless. I had no intention of answering her desperate cries for help or returning to a city that had caused me so much unearned pain. The version of me that sought their approval had died the night I was kicked out into the freezing rain without a jacket. I watched the paper turn to ash, recognizing that some bridges are simply not meant to be rebuilt after they have been burned so thoroughly. My final act in this chapter of my life was to complete the paperwork for a permanent transfer to our agency's branch in Denver. I needed to put 1,000 miles between myself and the toxic legacy of the Sterling family to truly begin my own healing process. My supervisors were happy to accommodate the move, recognizing that my work on the Portland fraud case had been exemplary and highly professional. I packed my belongings into a single van, choosing to take only the things I had purchased with my own hard-earned money. My future was no longer tied to the manipulation of a sister or the misplaced devotion of a mother who chose a lie over her own blood. I drove toward the mountains with a clear conscience, focusing on the road ahead rather than the wreckage I was leaving behind in Oregon. This is truly the price of choosing to believe in a lie instead of trusting the child who spent her whole life working for this family. I settled into my new apartment in Denver, feeling a sense of peace that had been absent from my life for as long as I could remember. The documents were filed, the house was gone, and the people who tried to break me were finally facing the reality of their own making. I was no longer an investigator in my own home, but a woman with the freedom to define her own worth and her own truth. My phone remained silent throughout the long drive, and I intended to keep it that way for the foreseeable future. The story of the Sterling family was over, and the story of my own life was finally beginning on my own terms. 3 months later, I am sitting on the balcony of my new apartment in Denver, feeling a sense of true freedom while watching the sunset over the mountains. The crisp air of Colorado is a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the house in Portland, where lies were the primary language spoken at the dinner table. I spent a long time wondering if I would feel a sense of triumph or joy after the legal collapse of my family's fraudulent empire. However, the dominant emotion in my heart is not malice, but a deep, quiet serenity that comes from finally fulfilling my professional and personal responsibilities. I no longer have to carry the heavy burden of other people's deceptions or sacrifice my own integrity to maintain a broken family peace. The constant anxiety that used to tighten my chest every time I visited my parents has completely vanished, replaced by a calm confidence in my own decisions. I spent the afternoon looking back at old photographs from my childhood, realizing for the first time just how much strength it took to walk away from a toxic dynamic. The images of a younger, smiling version of myself reminded me that I had been a victim of their emotional manipulation long before I became an investigator. I can see the subtle signs of exclusion in the way my parents hovered over Savannah while I stood alone on the edges of the family frame. It took me nearly 30 years to realize that being the responsible daughter was not a shield against their resentment, but rather a target for their frustration. Choosing to prioritize my own mental health over their demands for blind loyalty was the most difficult and courageous act of my entire life. I closed the old album and placed it in a storage box, acknowledging that those memories no longer have the power to dictate my future actions or emotions. The latest updates from Oregon confirm that Savannah's life has completely unraveled now that she has no one left to manipulate for financial gain. Without the constant indulgence of our parents and the stolen insurance money, she has been forced to face the harsh reality of demanding physical labor. She spends her days performing court-mandated community service and working low-wage jobs to meet the requirements of her massive restitution order. Her former lifestyle of simulated illnesses and expensive tastes has been replaced by the exhausting grind of trying to survive on a genuine income. There is no one to listen to her staged gasps for air or to offer her expensive tonics when the workday becomes too difficult to manage. This total collapse was inevitable because her entire identity was built on a foundation of lies that could not withstand the pressure of a federal investigation. My parents are also struggling to adapt to their new impoverished circumstances in the cramped rental unit they now call home. They are learning the hard way that the child they chose to protect was the very person who was actively plotting to leave them homeless and destitute. The neighbors and friends who once supported their decision to kick me out have now turned their backs on the entire family in the wake of the scandal. My father occasionally tries to reach out through third parties, but the messages are always filled with excuses rather than a genuine admission of their betrayal. I have remained firm in my decision to keep our interactions strictly limited to legal correspondence, refusing to let their desperation pull me back into their chaos. This distance is not an act of revenge, but a necessary boundary to ensure that I never have to experience that level of betrayal ever again. Reflecting on this journey has taught me several profound lessons that I believe are essential for anyone dealing with similar family dynamics. The first lesson is that you simply cannot save a person who actively chooses to be deceived by those they love more than the truth. My parents were given every opportunity to see the evidence, but their emotional attachment to Savannah's lies was stronger than their commitment to reality. Secondly, I have learned that personal boundaries are the only effective protection you have against relatives who view your success as a resource to be exploited. Without those boundaries, I would have eventually been dragged down into the financial and legal ruin that has now claimed the rest of my family. Finally, I have come to understand that true justice does not always come from a place of forgiveness or reconciliation between the parties involved. Sometimes, justice simply means stepping aside and allowing the natural consequences of the truth to unfold according to its own unstoppable internal logic. I have found a new community here in Denver that values my professional skills and respects my need for personal space and honest communication. My colleagues at the new agency branch appreciate my dedication to uncovering the truth without the clouded judgment of personal bias or emotional entanglement. I spend my weekends exploring the hiking trails and enjoying the silence of my own home, free from the drama that once defined my entire existence. The scars from my time in Portland are still there, but they serve as a reminder of the resilience I discovered within myself during the darkest moments. I am no longer defined by the role of the unwanted daughter or the whistleblower, but as a woman who had the courage to choose herself. My life is finally my own, and the path ahead is clear of the fog that Savannah spent so many years trying to maintain. Thank you all for listening to the end of my journey and for offering your support while I navigated this incredibly difficult transition. If you find yourself in a similar situation where your loyalty is being weaponized against your own well-being, please believe that the truth has its own power. You do not have to be the silent victim of someone else's greed just because you happen to share the same last name or family history. There is a world of peace waiting for you on the other side of that final difficult decision to walk away from the toxicity. Please share your own thoughts and experiences in the comment section below so we can continue this conversation and support one another. Your voice matters, and your commitment to the truth is the greatest gift you can ever give to yourself and those you love.